How's the online personality test coming along? Can't wait for it. Well, it's coming along pretty well. We have all the reports written, and we have the underlying computer architecture finished, and at the moment we're just polishing it up, essentially, and we're hoping that you'll be able to get a very detailed description of all 5 of the big 5 traits, right? Extroversion, that's a positive emotion dimension. That will break down into enthusiasm and assertiveness. And neuroticism, that breaks down into withdrawal. Like if you're in a state of withdrawal, then you're frozen with fear and don't want to do anything. You're afraid to go out. You're afraid to engage in any complex task because you might fail. You'll doubt yourself intensely. That's withdrawal in neuroticism. And then volatility is that kind of impulsive touchiness that people often develop when they're in a bad mood, where if you reach your finger out to touch them, they'll flinch and maybe slap you, and they're oversensitive to small slights and they don't have much of a sense of humor. And agreeableness, that subdivides into compassion and politeness, and the liberal types are more compassionate, and the conservative types are more polite, and politeness seems to be something like acting in accordance with the social norms governing interpersonal interaction, whereas compassion seems to be the proclivity to side with the weakest party, something like that. And I think it's the primary maternal dimension, because perhaps along with higher levels of negative emotion, because it's obviously the case that when you're dealing with children, especially infants, that you should take the side of the weaker party pretty much no matter what the logical argument is, right? Because an infant who's crying is always right, especially if it's under a year old. There's no logic to it. It's an a priori fact that a crying infant is correct. And so we don't know how that translates into the political sphere, because the most direct translation would be a complaining person is always right. And, I see that manifesting itself, I would say, quite clearly in the politically correct domain, is that you always side with the person who's manifesting negative emotion. And you always assume that there's an external reason that needs to be rectified in order to deal with that. And, it isn't obvious to me that agreeableness as an ethic is something that's transformable into the political or the adult landscape. But, we don't know these sorts of things, and we can't even talk about them because people automatically assume that that's sexist or misogynistic, or even though, there are agreeable men as well as agreeable women, because men are quite maternal for the kind of large apes and mammals that we are. But we need to take these sorts of things seriously, because it isn't obvious to me that an ethic of agreeableness can govern a complex polity. It looks to me more like conscientiousness is something that needs to govern arm's length transactions and that sort of thing, rather than treating everyone like kin, which you just can't do because you don't have the energy. Anyways, the test will also associate assess conscientiousness. That's orderliness, which seems to be associated with disgust sensitivity and is a good predictor of conservative belief. And industriousness, which is something like it's what it says exactly. It's the proclivity to engage in effortful work towards a defined goal in a reliable manner, and it's the second best predictor of long-term life success after IQ. And then the final thing it'll assess is openness to experience, which is more or less half creativity and half interest in ideas. And so if you take the test, you'll get about a 10-page report, and it's quite detailed, and it tells you where you fit on a percentile basis and what your strengths and weaknesses are going to be as a consequence. And we're going to produce a couples version so that 2 of you can take it, and then you'll get a report that tells you how you're similar and different, and where you're likely to have disagreements and agreements, where it's going to be difficult to negotiate a consensus. That'd be where you're widely different from one another on a trait. Like, it's hard for an extrovert and an introvert to come to an agreement about how much socializing they're going to do, because the extrovert says, well, let's socialize all the time, and the introvert says, well, once a year would be plenty for me. And those aren't opinions, right? They're built-in preferences that are far beneath the realm of opinion. And if you're high in openness and your partner is low in openness, like you're going to be interested in the theater and arts and literature and philosophy and talking about ideas and going to museums and that sort of thing. And your partner, in some sense, it'll be like they're colorblind. They just won't find that sort of thing engaging and interesting at all. And you might be able to shift someone a little bit to a higher degree of openness, but it's not an easy thing to do. And so we think, and the literature seems to indicate, that you should be fairly well matched on most of your traits with your partner, with the possible exception of neuroticism, because it isn't obvious that two people who are highly neurotic can get along. Neuroticism is a pretty good predictor of marital unhappiness, just like it's a good predictor of every other form of unhappiness. So